right, let's take a look and just make sure everything sounds correct. And once we're sure that it sounds correct, we will get going. Okay? Okie dokie, let's take a look. Let's see how things sound here. Let's take a look. Let's see how we sounded. Okay, I think everything's sounding okay. So without much further delay, we're just going to share this on Twitter. And after we share it on Twitter, we will get going. Okay, almost there. Just going to open up Twitter. Okie dokie. All right. Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whoever you are, wherever you are. My name is indeed Dr. Patrick Lockwood. For the purpose of this podcast, don't sue me or anything. I'm just Patrick. This is UnShrink Me. This is a weekly podcast, for those of you who don't know, dedicated to everything related to the concept of so-called mental health. And specifically, this podcast is for all the consumers of mental health services, because what I've realized in the span of my career so far as a clinical psychologist, coach, consultant, professor, is that, genuinely speaking, there are many people who are either being hurt by their professionals or at best in some cases just not helped. So this podcast is dedicated to the consumers of therapy, clinical psychology, counseling, couples therapy, coaching, psychiatry services. The goal of this podcast is extremely simple. I want to give you better quality information paired with, number two, high quality critique that's reasonable, practical, and understandable of clinical psychology topics, so that you get the most out of your mental health professionals, whoever you're working with. So that is the whole spirit of the UnShrink Me podcast. I am not here to advertise anything that I do professionally other than this YouTube channel. So this is not about my consulting life, my professional professor life, or anything like that. This is just me trying to share information and critique ideas publicly, so that whoever's out there getting therapy, coaching, consulting, counseling, psychiatry, whatever, can get the most out of it. That's the whole point of UnShrink Me, and that's it. So if you're here, you're watching or listening, thanks for being here. Always have some good chats usually. And usually what happens if you're brand new to this podcast is I take a look at a series of tweets, things that are posted online, and try to discuss the implications of what was said online publicly in a thoughtful, hopefully, maybe even funny way. We'll see. And as always, this podcast is not N-O-T, not sponsored by Celsius. However, I do love it, and it's great. And it fuels my life. So here we go. Without further delay, we have much to discuss. We have some things to discuss, maybe not much. So of the things we have to discuss, they are all mental health related, and they are from the interwebs here. So I'm going to start off with a softball, one of my own tweets, and then dive into some difficult topics about clinical competence and what it means to be a competent clinician, signs to look out for a competent clinician. I'm also going to talk about parenting, and from the perspective of, doing family therapy and things like that, what competent parenting looks like as it relates to mental health. And we're also going to be talking about, I think, DSM categories and things like that. So first, I want to start off with one of my posts, tweets, whatever. Because I think that it's worth reiterating. So first and foremost, Once upon a time, in a land called Twitter, I met up with this guy on Twitter named Ryan McRogers. And once upon a time, he and I did an interview. And on this interview, and I'm just going to repost it again, he asked me a question. And this question he asked me was a great question, which was, what do you think about why people come into therapy, basically, essentially? And this is a clip that has had, I think, tens of thousands of views, if I'm not mistaken, the original one in particular. And in this clip, which I hope you find me on Twitter, my Twitter handle is at AlobhaPatrick, ALOBHAPATRICK. So here's what the clip says. Literally. Excuse me. So here's what it says. Why do people come into the profession of therapy? So for those of you who are actively seeking out therapy, counseling, coaching, consulting, whatever, you might wonder what got your therapist into therapy. And in this clip of mine from his podcast, which is great, if you're at all interested in clinical psychology topics, Ryan's podcast is awesome. So here's the deal. Genuinely speaking, I believe, and I do not mean this in any cynical or negative or mean way, I believe that the vast majority of people that come into the profession do not come into the profession because they are simply well-adjusted, caring, and thoughtful. I think that is fake and unreal and unrealistic. I would say that the vast majority of people who do clinical work, couples therapists, individual therapists, pastoral counselors, family therapists, individual therapists, psychiatrists, whatever, are here because they have a series of needs that are unmet in a healthy way. They have a series of issues they do not understand fully. So my argument is not that people should, stop being therapists, just so we're clear. My hope is once people become so aware of all the reasons they became therapists and get their needs met more, let's say, adaptively across other areas of their life, they'll be less interested in doing clinical work. And maybe they'll do less clinical work or even quit, etc. But my goal is not to get people out of the profession. I'm a professor in graduate psychology, so I would be basically trying to put myself out of a job, which is never going to happen, unfortunately. So what I believe is there are a series of real, tangible problems that drive people towards the profession. And it's not just one thing like Jung's wounded healer or whatever. It's a series of problems, a series of developmental issues, unmet needs, things like that. So one of the things I talk about in that clip is unmet narcissistic needs. So everybody lives on a spectrum of narcissism. Some people score very high on trait narcissism, some people score very low. But everyone has some degree of a need to feel special, important, and valued. And so the folks that score higher, in many ways, are probably more likely to be therapists because you get special attention. You have one person staring at you and listening to everything you say, and you get to, quote unquote, help them, right? So you feel powerful and special and smart and all that stuff. Now, that's just one of many reasons why people probably come into the profession. I do not believe all therapists are narcissists. I don't believe that narcissism is the biggest driver of being a clinician. I just think it's one driver, right? So of the various variables that drive people to the profession, my hope for everyone who does this work, genuinely, is you figure out all the reasons that drove you to the profession. And once you're more aware of all those reasons, excuse me, you can find other ways to get your needs met such that maybe you're less interested in doing as much of the work as you're doing. Maybe you realize you want to do other things that allow you to thrive as a person. Some people will still do therapy because maybe they came for other reasons that I'm not aware of, etc. But I'm not saying therapy is bad. I'm not saying therapy is maladaptive. I'm not saying that only super sick, stupid people become therapists. That's not what I'm saying. I want to clarify. What I'm saying is there are a variety of reasons. There are a variety of unmet needs, unrecognized issues, things like that that drive people towards the profession. And I think my belief is if people recognize them, they would probably not stick around as long and do as much work in the profession, is my guess. That's just me. So, just to clarify, I hope that makes sense. Feel free to watch the clip that I reposted. It's worth it. Okay. Next on the agenda, I want to talk about parenting. So, my buddy Nick Tabor, good old Nick. I like Nick. I like Nick a lot. Nick is great at discussing provocative and important things. And I'm going to retweet one of his posts right now. And I hope that everyone understands what I'm about to do and why I'm about to do it. Okay. So, all right. So it's posted. So here's what Nick said about 7 hours ago. So he said, and I quote, "I like the distinction Alfie Kohn makes between doing to approaches and working with approaches. Doing to, giving consequences to approaches are inherently damaging to the child in the relationship. Even if you're practicing the 3 Ps, it's still a matter of one party with overwhelming power using that power to control and manipulate the powerless kid." So, I like Nick because Nick is good at being critical of the profession in many ways. Some of his criticisms I agree with, some of them I don't. But I want everyone who's watching and listening to understand something very simple, which is power is inevitable in relationships. So, I'm going to say that very clearly and very slowly, in case any of you missed it. Power is inevitable in relationships. And people have different amounts of power for different reasons, different types of power for different reasons. So Nick is very cautious and worried about the way professionals and authority figures misuse power to hurt their patients. He's also very aware of and caught in what's the best word? Nick is also very critical of the way school systems and families abuse power to hurt kids. It's a big topic of his, which I agree about, by the way. So the thing that prompted Nick's post was I said, there are 3 ways that you deliver consequences effectively to kids. Because he was talking about, I was trying to respond back and forth. Excuse me. So, in general, there are 3, if you look at the old school behaviorist literature, this is true. This is universally true. If you're a parent out there, I hope you're listening because you need to hear this. Consequences or punishments have to follow the 3 Ps to be effective. Okay? And if you don't do the 3 Ps correctly, you're going to hurt your kid, not help them. Right? So if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, if you're a school principal, dear God, listen, because you don't know what the fuck you're doing probably, but please listen. There are 3 Ps of consequences or punishments that work very, very well that we've known from the behaviorist literature for 120 years at this point. So please be clear about these 3 Ps. Effective consequences or punishments, same difference, have to be prompt. That's the first P. The second P is they have to be proportional. And the third P is that they have to be personal, aka meaningful to the person, right? So effective consequences, effective punishments are prompt, proportional, and personal. Okay? So just to walk through each of these 3 things very straightforwardly, and then I'll get to what Nick wrote. So if you're going to punish a kid, if you're going to punish an adult, if you're going to punish an employee, if you're going to punish your romantic partner, whatever. And I know the word punish is going to bring all sorts of hell upon me. So let's be clear that in the behaviorist sense, punishment just means any interaction, any stimulus that causes the behavior to happen less. That's what a punishment is. A punishment is any stimulus, anything that exists in the universe that causes a behavior to happen less. That's all it is. So, a good punishment, an effective punishment is prompt, it is proportional, and it is personal. So just to talk about prompt real quick. If someone does something that violates a rule and you punish them 6 weeks later, that punishment is not going to be meaningful, even if it's proportional and meaningful, right? So just a classic example of this is adults. Here in Los Angeles, in the land of the most despicable, terrible highway rules, with all these like toll roads and stuff like this, if you drive on a toll road without having some kind of pass or something, they take a picture of your license plate. 2 to 4 weeks later, you get a ticket in the mail that says, by the way, you drove on this road and you owe us $50 because you didn't have a fast pass or whatever it is. So is the amount of the fine probably not a big deal, or is it proportional? Probably. Is it personal? Like, do people care about money? Usually it matters to the person, but it's not prompt. It's 4 weeks later. Who gives a shit? So it will always be experienced as irrational or erroneous because it happens too far after the behavior that's problematic or whatever. So that's prompt. If you're going to punish someone, whether it's a child or an adult, if you're going to give somebody a consequence and you're trying to discourage a behavior, the punishment has to be prompt. It has to happen essentially right away, as quickly as humanly possible. But then there's the other two P's, which makes quickly difficult, which is it has to be proportional and it has to be personal. So let's talk about proportional. When you punish someone, doesn't matter if you punish a behavior of any kind, right? If you punish a behavior with a disproportionate, as in too large or too small, consequence, then it won't be meaningful. Okay? And my buddy Ryan's here in the chat. He says, this is true for positive and negative things, in my opinion. That's absolutely correct. I'll get more to that after I walk through the 3 Ps for everyone. So if a punishment is not proportional, if it's too big, for instance, right? So just to go back to kids for a second. If the kid steals a cookie and you spank them so hard that they can't walk the next day, that's not proportional. That punishment will be so intense that it will literally cause them to have more counterproductive behaviors. It might encourage them to steal more. It might encourage them to seethe in resentment and act out in other ways, but it will not be effective, right? So when you go too far, it will always be worse and make the person worse off. It will not discourage the behavior. Likewise, on the other side of the spectrum, if the punishment is too light, then it won't resonate and it won't actually make the person do the behavior less. So just to give an easy example of this in couples. If you're in a romantic relationship of some kind, whether you're married or not, if your romantic partner, if your spouse, if your significant other is doing a behavior you don't like, and all you do is say, I don't like that, and you do nothing else, and you say, I don't like that, that punishment is probably not going to cause the vast majority of people in romantic relationships to change their behavior. Because I don't like what you just did or said doesn't resonate usually with most people, because there are dozens of reasons why you wouldn't like something, and it may just be because you're messed up in some other way, and they can rationalize away why you don't like it. And so it's really important that, if you're in a romantic relationship, you're clear that when someone violates a boundary or a principle, a value of yours, that you have some proportionate response that encourages them to take it seriously, right? So consequences have to be proportional to the intensity of the violation, right? So in a couple, if you don't like cursing, let's just use a simple, easy example. If you don't like cursing, and your partner curses all the time, for instance, because that happens, then you might want to go overboard and yell and scream at them, but that won't work. That won't discourage the behavior. And you might do too little and say, I don't like it when you curse. That's probably not going to do it as well. You might need to do something more aversive, like set a boundary and say, if you do that again, I will walk away from you, right? Very simple. It's not a harsh thing. Walking away is not like flipping them off, punching them in the face. abandoning them forever. But if you do this behavior, I will remove myself from the situation, for instance. That's a proportional consequence, right? It's not, I'm going to divorce you. I'm going to divorce you is a wildly extreme, disproportionate consequence, right? So you have to do more. You have to do something that's closer to the intensity and the severity of the offense, if that makes sense. So it has to be prompt. It has to be proportional. And number three, the third P of consequences of disciplining is it has to be personal, right? You literally have to give people a consequence that matters to them. Because if you give them a consequence that does not matter to them, they will just register it as not important, literally, right? So, for some kids, the consequence of timeout doesn't bother them at all because they're happy to be by themselves. Maybe it's like an autistic kid, and being by themselves is totally A-okay because that's what they prefer, right? So trying to use timeout with an autistic kid may not work great in many cases. With other kids, it might work great, right? But you have to be clear that whatever consequence you're giving to someone, if it's not something that matters to them, they won't give a shit. And it won't cause them to do the behavior that you think is bad less, right? So the three P's of consequences, of punishments, are neither good nor bad. They're neither moral nor immoral. It's just a descriptive system for looking at what will actually work effectively. So in the chat here, he says, I like the breakdown of natural, logical, and punitive consequences. Natural is usually best since you're doing nothing. Logical is essentially the three P's, and punitive has a retributive element. Yeah, there's also restorative justice, which I like as a concept. So if you punch a hole in something, it's your job to plaster and repair the hole in the wall or whatever. But all of that aside, I want to get to what Nick said because Nick, I think Nick completely missed the point with what he said. And Nick, if you watch this, tell me if I'm explaining things correctly and if I'm addressing what you said correctly. So here's, again, I'm going to read what Nick said again, and you tell me if I'm on par. So again, he says, I like the distinction Alfie Kohn makes between doing to approaches versus working with approaches. Doing to approaches are inherently damaging to the child and the relationship. Even if you think you're practicing the three P's, it's still a matter of one party with overwhelming power, he says, using that power to control and manipulate the powerless kid. So there's a couple of things I think Nick is incorrect about that I want to talk about. So number one, just to start in reverse order, Nick said doing to hurts people because the kid is powerless. And here's what I would like everyone to hear loud and clear. Children are not powerless, especially as they get older. In fact, the older the child gets, the more power they have, right? So legally, kids may have not as much power because they're not considered adults. But morally and emotionally, kids are perfectly powerful, especially as they reach the age of puberty, right? So when kids are 2 or 3, yes, they're very powerless because they don't have language, they don't have gross motor skills, they're not big, they don't have a lot of muscle, etc. But a 16-year-old who's 6'3", 230 pounds with a perfectly functioning vocabulary and motor skills who can beat the ever-loving hell out of you has plenty of power, and that 16-year-old is just as dangerous as a 35-year-old. So what I would say is, in fact, they're probably more dangerous because their cortex is underdeveloped to some degree, and they're still capable of making rational decisions despite the fact that they're underdeveloped. So teenagers in particular are not powerless. They just have different kinds of power, right? And so what I would say is, kids are not powerless. Kids have some power. Kids have emotional power. They can do things to emotionally manipulate other kids and parents and siblings and family members. So this framing of kids as powerless, I disagree with Nick. And I think you probably would agree with me, but I don't know. Number two, You said overwhelming power. Parents have overwhelming power. Some parents do. Some parents are indeed Machiavellian or disgustingly arrogant or narcissistic or selfish or whatever, and they are overwhelmingly using their power to harm kids or to have a one-dimensional, one-directional relationship with their child. That happens. But the idea that all parents have overwhelming power is also not true. Because I can tell you from years of working in drug rehabs that many parents, some of whom are very smart and successful lawyers, doctors, whatever it is, are absolute cowards. Some parents have no power. Some parents have completely ceded their power to their very unwell loved one. And so I would say that they have chosen to give up whatever power they used to have in many cases. So it's actually not this one-directional parents are all powerful relationship you describe. It sounds like you're doing some all or nothing thinking there, Nick, and I don't agree with you in that regard. And to go back to this idea of doing to versus doing with, I think it depends upon what kind of consequence you think is proportional and meaningful to the kid. So if the kid, let's just use a simple example. If you have an unruly child, maybe they can be described as having oppositional defiant disorder. And for those of you who don't know, ODD is not a real diagnosis. It's a bullshit label in the DSM for kids with shitty parents. If your kid's acting out and can be described with ODD, either they have something else going on or you just don't know how to have consistent boundaries with your kid. So the truth is, if your kid has ODD, and they punch a hole in the wall, and you want to do the thing called restorative justice, something that's proportional is, well, you destroyed this piece of the wall, so now it's your job to take time out of your day. You don't get to do other things you want to do, so we're going to remove something that you want to do, and you're going to fix the wall, you're going to spackle it, you're going to paint it, and then you're going to apologize, right? 3 things. Fix it, paint it, apologize, right? So is that a doing to or a doing with? Because technically it's a doing to. You're going to do this thing to make up for your behavior that's not acceptable, right? Punching holes in walls in most cultures is not acceptable. Get a punching bag if you want to punch something, but that catharsis won't work, by the way. But still, punching holes in walls, I think, universally unacceptable in most households. So what you should do is you should do something like what we call restorative justice, where you fix the thing that you broke, right? And so it's very clear that in that scenario, nobody is being hurt, right? The kid just has to not do something they want to do, like play video games or watch TV or whatever it is, and instead they have to fix the wall. So what you do is you give them the resources to fix the wall. You don't force them to walk all the way to the hardware store and buy the paint and buy the spackle and all this stuff. What you do is you sit with them, next to them, at the wall. You tell them how to do it. So that's a doing with approach, I guess. And you watch them do it. And you watch them paint. And when they're done, they apologize and it's over. And it's never talked about again, right? So that is proportional. It's personal because they're losing something they want, right? So a negative consequence is one where you take away something they want. So you don't get to do something you want to do right now. You have to spend your time with me fixing the wall, right? So it's proportional, it's personal, and it's prompt. You fix the wall right away. You don't fix it 5 weeks later. You fix it that same day. And that's a great thing to do. And it works perfectly well. And if they choose to defy you and not fix the wall, you take away something else, or you give them a new chore they have to do until they finally give in to your consequence. But you have to be consistent and proportional and personal and prompt. So the 3 Ps, Nick, are not cruel. There are cruel people out there. There are stupid parents. There are plenty of bad parents in the world. And I genuinely believe plenty of people misuse power. However, shout out to power being a good thing. Power is a good thing. Using power reasonably, contextually appropriately is a great thing. So I want parents to feel empowered. Dr. Patrick Lockwood, licensed clinical psychologist, professor, consultant, family therapist. I want people to feel empowered. If you're a parent, I want you to feel maximally empowered. And I want you to use your power reasonably with your children, with your siblings, spouses, whatever. And none of that is Machiavellian. And none of that's disgusting or cruel. So the 3 Ps are airtight. It's about how you apply them, Nick. Ryan says, Mike, kids are not powerless. No, kids are perfectly powerful in many situations. In some cases, kids are proportionally powerful, equally powerful. Like some adolescents have all sorts of emotional manipulative power. If you don't think kids have power, I encourage you to watch the satirical cartoon TV show called South Park. Eric Cartman is an extremely manipulative sociopath and perfectly capable of doing terrible things. And if you think Eric Cartman is just a caricature and not a real kid, there are real kids like Eric Cartman, and they are dangerous to society, and they exist. I've met them, I've worked with them. So if you don't think people with serious personality pathology exist, I have news for you. Even kids. Ryan says, my kids have the amazing power to dysregulate my emotions on a daily basis. You sound like a dad. As they speak, they are making me leave this and set up a fort. Well, that's a good thing, though. You should go have fort time with your kids, in my opinion, in my personal opinion. So I hope you have fun with fort time. So again, just to reiterate to everyone watching and listening, this is not rocket science. It is difficult, but it's not rocket science. If you're going to punish someone, and I'm not saying punishment is the only solution, by the way. There are multiple solutions to help people change their behavior with regard to, morals and values. So there's shaping, which is all about positive reinforcement, and then there's punishment, right? And there's 2 types of punishment: positive punishment and negative punishment. Positive punishment is where you give somebody something aversive, and negative punishment is where you take away something somebody likes to punish them to discourage the behavior. Drew says, I'm still in grad school, but the way that professors and supervisors confuse power versus authority concerns me. We should talk more about that, Drew. Why don't you say a little bit more about that? And after I'm done reiterating the 3 Ps, we can talk about it. So, effective punishments. And by the way, punishments are not the only way to change child behaviors or change adult behaviors. You can use shaping, which is all reward-based. But if you do need to do punishment, which sometimes you do, punishment's a very useful tool. As an employer, you can write people up and fire them. As a supervisor, as a romantic partner, as a parent, as a friend, punishments are perfectly useful and effective and moral if they're done reasonably, right? And the 3 Ps of effective punishments are, again, if the punishments are prompt, they happen right away. They happen as soon as humanly possible. Number 2, they're proportional, which means that they're not so big that they don't teach the lesson they're supposed to teach, and they're not so light that they don't actually affect the person. And number 3, effective punishments are personal, which means that they actually are meaningful to the individual. Because if you give somebody a punishment that doesn't matter to them, like look at the big pharmaceutical companies, you can charge them $100 million, but they've got billions and billions of dollars. Who cares about $100 million? They keep doing the same shady, corrupt stuff that they always do, because who cares about $100 million? They can afford it. They have a war chest, right? So punishments have to be prompt, proportional, and personal. Willow agrees. And if punishments are not prompt, if they're too delayed, they won't work. If punishments are not proportional, if they're too big or too small, they won't work. If punishments are not personal, if they don't mean anything to the kid, to the adult, to the employee, then they just won't work. Some employees you can just have a conversation with and it will change their behavior. As someone who hires and fires people for a living, sometimes my punishment is to have a difficult conversation with people. Sometimes my punishment is to write people up. Sometimes it's to do both, right? So it's whatever is actually personal, whatever is meaningful to that individual. Okay? And I hope everyone understands that I am not necessarily use punishment all the time guy. You know, Machiavelli would say, wipe the floor with people and destroy their entire lineage or something like that. But he's also talking about statecraft and all that stuff. But generally speaking, I'm not Machiavellian. I'm just trying to describe what actually works in what particular kinds of ways, right? So to go back to Drew's comment in the chat here, for those of you just listening or coming after the fact, Drew said, I'm still in grad school, but the way that professors and supervisors confuse power versus authority concerns me. So let's be real about this. I'm a professor in graduate psychology. I'm a clinical supervisor. I understand that I have a lot of power because specifically I can do certain things to affect the entire trajectory of people's careers. I can fail people out of my classes and in some cases end their career altogether. As a clinical supervisor, I cannot sign off on your hours and you can never get licensed because of that, or it can delay your licensure by years, right? So I have power, which is different than authority. Power is, as Drew is saying here, using the word power frequently to describe your power differentials feels like a catch-all. You're right. Power isn't all bad, he says, but authority is a nice contract. Authority is earned to some degree. In fact, what I would say, what I was just about to say, Drew, as you're writing that, is authority is earned. Authority, is, to me, is some combination of experience plus respect. And you can have all the experience in the world, but if people do not respect you, you can say you're an authority all you want, but if people don't respect your opinion, it doesn't mean anything. You can be the smartest person in the room, but if nobody respects what you're saying, it doesn't matter. So authority is experience plus respect, in my opinion. Drew says, maybe it's just my experience. I'm in counseling psych, so a lot of the focus on social issues and such. Yeah, well, in counseling psychology, good luck, Good luck, sir. Best of luck to you in your grad program. So good clinical supervisors and good professors. Let me get rid of the word good. Effective clinical supervisors and effective professors usually mix their power and authority, in such a way that they're trying to use what they know and their influence to help people along the path, not to dissuade them or discourage them. Usually. Some people are in graduate psychology and need to be kicked out of the profession. And they do get weeded out in grad school often. Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. And it sucks because they spent money and time starting their degree, but they shouldn't be there. So this has been a 30-something minute discussion of the 3 Ps of effective consequences. They are proportional, they are personal, and they're prompt. I hope that makes sense to everyone. And thank you, Nick, as always, for the discussion about the misuse of power. Power is okay if it's used correctly. In fact, power is awesome if it's used correctly. So the next one I want to talk about, simple, quick comment. I'm just going to retweet it. There's this person named Ty Lopez, who I've never seen before, I think. I just found this, so I'm just going to retweet it real quick. His handle is at TAILOPEZ. Okay, so here's what Ty said. You're welcome, Drew. Here's what Ty said. Forgive your parents. They were learning how to raise kids the first time around, just like you will be. So this might be a bit of a hot take. I don't know. Here's what I would say. If you want to be miserable, don't forgive your parents. If you want to be miserable, then don't forgive them. If you don't want to be miserable, then forgive them. Because resentment seems to make you more sick than the other person. So, do I think parents are universally good? No. I think there's a lot of shitty parents in the world. I think there are a lot of people that have sucked hardcore, like a bad porn star, at talking about principles with their kids, being consistent and reliable, being encouraging. There's so many people right now who badly need encouragement because their parents sucked so bad at it and their friends suck so bad at it. But, if you believe your parents should have been great, should have understood how to deal with you, then I think you're mistaken, because parents are just regular people. And most of them are pretty ignorant. Most parents are also extremely ignorant of their own stuff. I wish that weren't the case. But if parents have trauma, personality issues, whatever it is, excessive shame or guilt or whatever, they're going to hurt you. And that's not weird. Excuse me. But some parents are cruel. And some parents are grossly ignorant and neglectful. And those people deserve a lot of help, in my opinion. But genuinely speaking, most parents are just ordinary people. And they're not doing their best, to be fair. I think there's this bullshit trope that most parents are quote unquote just doing their best. That's not true. Most parents are not doing their best. Most parents are doing what they think they should do. And in some cases, they're doing their best, and God bless them. And you should have a lot more grace for people who are doing what they believe is their best. Now, the people that just don't care, the lazy parents, the angry parents, the selfish parents, those people are not doing their best. So fuck them. But the ones that are trying their hardest, God bless them, and grace for them even when they screw up. So it's not a one-size-fits-all simple quote tie. But I think it's mostly useful for you, the individual, the adult child or child of really screwed up parents, to try to figure out how to forgive them at some point. Because the resentment will only make you sicker, in my opinion. So anyways, that's just my opinion. It's my personal opinion, my Patrick Lockwood, not Dr. Patrick Lockwood opinion. Okay, let's talk about Dr. Roger McFillin. So, I'm going to retweet this real quick. His handle, by the way, is at DRMCFILLIN. Got a very kid punishment focused podcast today, apparently. I don't know why. So here's what Dr. McFillin said on February 28th, so a couple of weeks ago. He said, and I quote, "Let's talk about the greatest magic trick of all. Convincing an entire generation that their inability to focus on mind-numbing busy work while surrounded by the most advanced attention-hijacking technology in human history is somehow a brain disorder. Your kid can't sit still for 7 hours under fluorescent lights in a cinder block room memorizing state capitals? Must be ADHD. Your teenager can't focus on homework after spending 6 hours being bombarded by algorithmically perfected dopamine hits from TikTok and Instagram? Clearly a neurological condition. You find it hard to read 3 consecutive pages of a book without checking your phone 17 times? Definitely ADHD. We have lost our collective minds, literally." So in his post, very sarcastically or tongue-in-cheek, he gave a series of examples of how young kids and adolescents are being basically diagnosed with ADHD and similar conditions because, as he's pointing to, they have all sorts of environmental circumstances that are radically different that are affecting the way they function. So I want to talk about the 2 categories of things that he mentioned that screw up kids' ability to focus and stay, let's say, engaged in school. Because I think a lot of school psychologists, don't get this right. I think many of you listening right now either have kids or will have kids, and you're worried about them developing an anxiety disorder or being autistic or diagnosed with ADHD or something. And so I want to be clear about this because I think it's important. So, in full sincerity, I believe that there are some kids that we would legitimately describe as having what we call ADHD. Some kids are extremely hyper. They have an inability to sit still. And not just because they're caffeinated, and not just because they're anxious, and not just because there's trauma in the home, but because no matter what circumstance you find them in, they could be at the park by themselves. They could be in their room alone. They could be with their parents. They could be with their friends. They have a hard time sitting still. They like to move. They're movement-oriented creatures. So those hyperactive impulsive types are real. And they might even look different neurologically to some degree. Even though the research isn't great, they might be a little different. And the kids that are predominantly inattentive, again, not great research on that in terms of what the brain looks like, but some kids really do have a hard time focusing. And, it's definitely true that a lot of kids are misdiagnosed because they have a bunch of trauma in the house, and that's the real problem, or they have an anxiety disorder, and that's the real problem. But for most people, ADHD is not a real thing. There's a lot of people that have ADHD and they don't go diagnosed and their life is worse. Now, for many people, their ADHD in childhood can become an adaptation that's useful for them if it's managed correctly, but it requires management. But the problem Dr. McFillin is pointing to is that smartphones and excessive caffeine use and technology and being forced to sit in a brick classroom for 7 hours a day. Let's talk about that real quick. So there's no animal species that sits around 7 consecutive hours a day. Most animals move. There's a lot of sleeping in many species. It's true. Look at that. Look at this right here. Look at this foot. You see this foot? You can't see the foot. There's a microphone in the way. Well, look at that. Look at that sleepy thing, right? Like, a lot of species just lay around, for sure. But they're resting. They're intermittently resting. Whereas sitting in school and trying to sit there and do stuff like learning, and this probably sounds weird coming from a professor, but let me say it very clearly. It's absurd that people are expected to sit for multiple hours at a time. Absurd. And the fact that we try to encourage kids to do this is even more absurd. So Dr. McFillin, in my opinion, is correct that much of what is considered psychopathology, and I bet Nick Tabor would agree with this too, is absolutely not psychopathology in a school setting. So if your kid is being sent to the school counselor or the school psychologist or whatever, there's a really good chance that they don't actually have a disorder. There's a really good chance that maybe they have some anxiety, or maybe they're just being forced to do absolutely mind-numbingly stupid stuff, like sit there and read for multiple hours of the day, or take a bunch of tests that don't have any actual meaning for them, right? So the problem is most early primary education is not meaningful to kids, kind of like those consequences being personal and meaningful. It's not meaningful. The other problem is, thanks to the internet, thanks to Instagram and TikTok, like he said, if you're 13 or 15 and you have access to the internet and you can see people that are rich, or at least they look rich even if they're not, but you see all these fitness influencers and finance influencers and comedians and internet personalities and all these people who are successful and thriving, and nothing has to do anything with what you're learning in high school. Why would you give two shits about high school if you can just be rich by being hot and being on peptides and being an influencer at the age of 17 or 18 or whatever? If you're a dude, and if you're a chick, OnlyFans and all that stuff, why would you care about education if you can go be successful and have a good life and have a good family and have good friends and never have to give a shit about history textbooks, calculus, earth sciences, or whatever. Why would you have to care when the quote unquote good life is already out there on the internet for you to see? And you're not doing this bullshit Austrian education system that makes you a good factory worker. So, on this particular topic, when it comes to kids and mental health, I believe that most kids are not mentally ill. Even the ones that are diagnosed with ADHD, autism, anxiety, whatever it is, most of these kids are not mentally ill. Most of them probably are in crappy families in some situations. In other situations, really crappy school systems because the schools are terrible and boring and not built for, a modern workforce. But also, none of these schools actually cater to the individual personality differences of kids. Because if that kid's super creative, or if that kid's super practical, if you're going to become a car mechanic, you do not need calculus. Calculus is absolutely useless if you're going to go fix someone's radiator on their Chevy. It means nothing. It's absolutely useless. So the truth of the matter is that our education system is terrible from top to bottom. We are ranked so low in the rest of the world. And we still have a good economy from the point of view of like people making money, but we're not ready. We're not making good kids. Even my generation, older millennials, really badly underserved by the educational system. So most kids that are quote unquote anxious in school, they don't have an anxiety disorder. They have either shitty parents, shitty school programming, or an understimulating world, or all three. Crappy teachers, overworked teachers, and that's why they're crappy. Mentally ill teachers, most of them have some problems, right? So let's be clear. There's a lot of reasons why kids are not quote unquote thriving in primary education, right? Here's a comment right here that I'm going to double down on. It might get me canceled or whatever, but it's the truth. And I'm going to expand on it too. So Megan said, a significant percentage of parents love a diagnosis because it absolves their poor parenting. I agree. I think many parents would rather their kids be autistic, have a learning disability, ADHD, trans, whatever it is, because that absolves them of their screwed up ways of dealing with their kids. Now, there is such a thing as real gender dysphoria. There is such a thing as real ADHD. There is real autism. All these things are absolutely real, and in many cases, very impairing. However, often it's parents that are screwed up. Now, to be fair to parents, not to just shit on parents. Sometimes parents are really stupid, and that is not their fault. There's a lot of not very intelligent people out there, and they just don't understand the complexity of the person, the kid they're sitting across from. Same thing's true for teachers. The second thing that I'd like to do to excuse parents to some degree is most parents are overwhelmed and do not realize how their overwhelm affects their ability to be present and do basic things correctly with their kids. And some of that's not their fault because they had shitty parents themselves. So I said some of that, by the way, not all of it. So there's a lot of ignorance and there's a lot of desperation for some parents. And it's also terrifying for many people to believe that they've actually hurt their kid. And so they'd rather be in denial. That's true as well. And that's human. So there's a lot of normal human suffering that causes the next generation to suffer, in my opinion. And the school system doesn't make it better. In fact, I think it usually makes it worse. So my main takeaway from that particular tweet, Dr. McFillin, is I actually agree with you in many ways that the system is broken. We're not producing healthier kids. We're producing seriously screwed up kids in many ways. I think there's a lot of obesity because schools are fucked with their food and their activity time. We're letting little kids sit all day when they should be playing more of the day. We're letting kids not do creative things. We're canceling choir and band and stuff because test scores and crap like that. It's terrible. And I think that, if you're a parent out there, I hope you do everything you can to enrich your child's learning by encouraging them to study whatever it is they're good at and they love, and be active and do sports and do music and do everything they can to learn practical things that make their life better. That's my belief. So, the school thing is tough. The kid thing is tough. It's hard to be a parent. I have no doubt that it's really hard to be a parent. I have no doubt that it's hard to be a teacher. I'm a professor of adults, and I can only imagine what it's like to teach, kids in the middle of puberty. That sounds terrible. So I get that it's hard, and I'm not saying that it's like a one-size-fits-all evil and it's an oversimplified evil. It's just there's lots of complicated problems, and our school system is not built to solve those problems. So that is my soapbox about that. And finally, what I would say for today's podcast is that we all have a really cool opportunity while the world seems to be falling apart and stuff to do something very simple, which is just to learn how to manage our feelings better. And if you need help from a professional, I hope you get it. And if you can do things like eat, sleep, move, and laugh better, you can do more of that. I'm a big proponent of everyone's mental health improving by eating a little bit better every day, moving a little bit more, sleeping a little bit better, laughing a little bit more. I think these are all good things for mental health. And I believe that it's genuinely difficult, in my opinion, to just do these 4 things: eat, sleep, move, and laugh. But I think it's totally doable. And everyone can improve their mental health by just doing simple things. If these won't fix your mental health, if you have actual PTSD, eating a little better, sleeping a little better, moving a little more will not fix your PTSD. If you have major depressive disorder or whatever, it's just not going to fix things. It will help though. So I hope you take really good care of your physical health by moving as much as you can. That's good for you. Exercising, gym, whatever. Walking. I hope you sleep as much as you can that your schedule affords, and you eat the best possible foods for your needs, and you laugh as much as you can, because humor is important for everybody's sanity. So, eat, sleep, move, laugh. That's my new thing. Well, we've had a pretty good chat here today. A lot of people came out to chat. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Megan and Drew and Ryan and everyone else. I really appreciate all the participation and the likes and comments. If you heard something today that was helpful, interesting, confusing, engaging, I hope that you would like and share and subscribe to my channel, The Psychology Checkup. This is the UnShrink Me podcast, a podcast dedicated only to improving people's experiences in mental health services. This is not clinical advice directed at you, the individual. This is me talking more generally, so don't sue me. Feel free if you want to, but please don't. And I think that's it for today. And as always, I like to end every podcast with a joke if I can. And so I think I've come up with a new one. I don't know if it'll be good, but we'll see. And so without further delay, until next week, here is my joke for today's podcast. So, I once had this patient who was a foot doctor, a podiatrist. Interesting dude. Mid-40s, nice guy, personable. He was dating around, and as he was dating around, he had a difficult time trying to figure out how to find the right person, because as a doctor, you've got a difficult, complicated schedule usually, and starting your career, you work a lot and all this stuff. But also, nowadays it's just hard for people to date. And so here's what he was doing. He was on all the apps. He did Tinder and Bumble and all that stuff. But he also struggled with finding people who aligned with his values. And so he was trying to do the values-based dating thing, and he finally met someone. And so, after our most recent session, he went on a date with this person that he thought was a good fit, and they had a great time. And he came back to me next week, and he told me all about her. She's awesome, attractive, similar values, goals in life, parenting goals, things like that. Awesome. So everything was sounding good. He was feeling better. He was less confused, all this stuff, which is awesome. So He comes back to me next week for session. He says, Doc, I don't know what to do with myself because I'm extremely conflicted. I said, why are you conflicted? Last week, everything was great. You just met this person, everything seemed to be clicking, all this stuff. What happened? So here's what he told me. He said that apparently this girl that he was dating had this really big foot fetish. And so the main reason she was attracted to him is that she had a foot fetish. And she assumed that because he is a foot doctor, he also had some special interest in feet. And like they tried to like mess around and stuff, and she was just massaging his feet, and she tried to start licking his feet and all these things. And he said, I'm not really into that, actually. I'm not really a foot fetish guy. And she kept licking my toes and stuff, and I couldn't do it. And he just looked really despondent. He looked super like depressed and sad. And he said, well, what do you think, Doc? And I said, well, it looks like the shoe's on the other foot. All right. Well, I hope you all have a good rest of your week. Take very good care of yourselves. Eat good food. Move a lot. Have good sex. Have good friends. Have fun. And I'll see you next week.